Welcome to Rauta's opinion video. Today the topic is the touring life and the age of the band actually ruining the band, or is it just some random occurrence, or whatever are the real reasons somewhere else than exactly the band's age and the touring life and whatever, when the albums get crappier by the year. Now, I'm not an expert on anything, much less in topics like this, but I gotta say that most albums by bands later in the career, so to say, are usually not the best possible ones. They are usually, more often than not, the ones that kinda pale in comparison to bands' earlier years. And got quite many bands actually had the golden era somewhere between, maybe not in the beginning, but quite early in the career, and somewhere, the midlife phase, so to speak. And I'm trying to ponder why most of the bands fail with, later years, even though they might be busy touring and they are getting more experienced and skilled and whatnot. Now, this kind of came to my mind when I was seeing Cannibal Corpse live a couple of weeks ago, and they did a great show, very kind of a general in their way and their career. I've witnessed the band before a few times, but their latest album, Red Before Black, is, in my opinion, one of the better albums of the whole band's career, and they've been here like 30 years and still kicking the butt. And I started to feel that maybe it's Cannibal Corpse that's actually one of the exceptions to the rule, because they tour actively, they release album every 2 years or so, and they most of the time they do solid job. Whereas these kind of metal dinosaurs, Metallica, Iron Maiden, etc., well, most of them have not done nothing really good since 80s, when they peaked, which was their golden era. For example, Metallica. As much as I like the band, and especially the early years and the early albums, because I, grew up with Metallica's music much of my teenage years, and when I still see the band on stage this year, or saw this spring, I still think it's a great live band, and they know what they're doing. But album-wise, they haven't released a really solid album since, I think, early 1990s, when Black album came out, and that is almost 30 years ago. But nevertheless, they are still sold out, and everything is going smooth when the touring comes. But their late albums have been more or less disappointing. And since they are one of the most active touring bands, I can't help myself but think that maybe it's the touring life that actually is draining their well of creativity, empty. Or maybe it's just these guys are old as hell and they don't know exactly what they did, right with their early years. I mean, their first 10 years or so, that was the golden era. That was the reason why Metallica is such a big band now. But later years, not so much. And for that, we cannot even use the excuse that that's because they release album every 2 years, because they don't. On the contrary, Metallica is one of those bands which isn't that active, but nevertheless, their albums are not that good. Iron Maiden, on the other hand, it's much like Cannibal Corpse, very active touring, but also doing albums every 2 or 3 years basically. And they have a huge discography. But the thing is, in my opinion, they haven't done really good albums since 80s. I mean, the 80s was also their golden era, kind of a heavy metal wow moment. Much like some people consider Black Sabbath's early album to be the phase, the era of the band. And later years are so much, well, different, even not the same band. And even if we move to more, less big names, kind of not underground names, but bands like Darkthrone or even Satyricon in black metal, well, I think, Dark Throne basically defined Norwegian black metal with their unholy trinity, Ablaze in the Northern Sky to Under a Funeral Moon in Transylvania in Hungary. But after that, even though they made great albums, they started to get sloppy, they changed their style too much, and well, to me they are not the same band as they used to be, and still I could say that they're probably the most meaningful black metal band for me ever. Even Burzum, same thing basically. After Philosophem, everything started to go more or less down, and by that time that particular band hadn't been active even 10 years. So only a few years of this really creative spark, or this really hot flame, this even white hot flame, and then everything is just, it's just like your barbecue grill is which just decided to die after the coals started to lose the flame and all that stuff. Now, like I said, I'm not expert on this, and I don't have any figures or numbers why some bands are better with their later years and some used to have these early young fire that kind of made them define that the time when the fire was so hot that even the rocks would melt and be kind of like hot lava that would define. And when it gets cold, it becomes like Satyricon. It's just boring, utterly boring, and really mediocre music. Now, so many bands seem to have this thing, especially if they're making albums like quite often, like say every 2 or 3 years. It seems that they are, pumping the well of creativity more quickly than that well actually gets filled. But then again, and this kind of almost proves my point, but not to all people especially to those who actually didn't like the album. But for example, Dimmu Borgir, it took like 8 years for them to do a new album. And to me, it sounds like they came back really fresh. Obviously, they have been touring and whatnot, but I could bet my hand that not as actively, not as big as, those really, really big names. Yeah, Iron Maiden, Metallica, but also others like Slayer and whatnot. Slayer is also a good example. Their prime was with Raining Blood. So about 5 years to their existence. Definitely less than 10, even if we take into account for like Seasons, not Seasons in the Abyss, but yeah, that too, but South of Heaven. And pretty much they started their decline, more or less, after that. And well, even though I'm a big Slayer fan, I like most of them, the albums they have done later years. But still, it's not like they have managed to go even close to, Raining Blood. So, I mean, so many bands kind of start to lose their grip when they get older, when they tour a lot. And I cannot help thinking that maybe these bands should, tour less in order to keep the level high. Of course, it's just my opinion, and I'm not, by no means I'm saying that I'm right. But I cannot help to think that when bands start to depend, the livelihood on their tour life and selling merchandise and, well, even selling records to a certain extent, they are starting to kind of lose the magic there. I'm not gonna say it's the money that is to blame, but I think when bands' life is the job, when all those touring kind of define you more than picking your guitar and start going for the riffs and all that stuff, I think that's when it starts to change. Also, when people get older, the ideas change. You might start to have this urge to try out something different. For example, if you were like to your 15s and you create your first band, you would just want to play some aggressive death metal. Maybe 5 years later, you want to go different ways. Not just because you're a poser or anything, that's beyond the scope of this video, but more because you just want to try out different things. When people get older, the tastes, what you feel like doing is about to change. It will change, no matter what you do. I mean, of course, there are random boneheads here and there, which can pretty much do the same kind of music without any changes or evolution or whatever experimentation, like 30 years. But in my opinion, those are really scarce. Like most people just wanna go different paths, try out different things, and obviously that usually means that the band is going to lose some fan base, maybe grow it, maybe even outgrow the numbers lost, but still it's gonna mean some difference to the band. And even if it happens like when you're 25 or something, between 25 and 40, a lot of things happen in people's lives. People get families maybe, or they just, get fed up with their teenage dreams and whatnot. And well, music is still at this, kind of a music taste is at the sensitive phase where, just you want to explore. I know this, some of my friends who might have been, having an oath for in the name of black metal when they were like the 20s, and nowadays they might be just not like blah, do I care? And this is only example. I'm not saying that okay, he was too weak to become a real black metalhead. He didn't have his heart for Satan. Yeah, maybe not, but this is not the genre thing, because the same kind of thing might have been happening in other places as well. Some say people get more sensitive as they get older, so even though some people started with, some brutal death metal, they might end up doing melancholic, melodic, soft pop, whatever music later years and whatever. But I think it's also because that once you go the same path for so long and you feel like you've told every story there is to be told about that stuff, it's kind of natural you want to change and explore things. But some bands just want to stick to the story they have, but they don't manage to, do the trick again. For example, in sports, it's kind of a clear that we peak around, well, this depends totally on the sports, but in some sports we peak around our 20s. Some sports maybe 30 or even 40s, but usually it's younger than 40. So it is not so much a miracle that actually people start to explore new things, and they might still feel like they're peaking at some other band or some other style, even genre, that what they were doing, for the first time around. For example, Metallica's Kill 'Em All, a real classic, a legendary album. But I think there are only like handful of people, of course more than that, but compared to real numbers of Metallica fans who actually go hailing Metallica because of Kill 'Em All. They are different songs that actually kind of define them and say that these are the songs that matter the most, or these are the songs that I remember first when the band's name is said to me. And so I think the same applies to smaller bands as well, like be it Dark Throne or even smaller bands. So I think, like once again, I feel like I'm thinking that bands kind of start to lose their grip, and no matter how much bands like Iron Maiden or bands like Satyricon or any other band for that matter try to kind of emulate their younger years, they're destined to fail, because either they don't chase enough or they chase too much. And if they start to become a cheap ass copycat of themselves, then it's kind of a bad. I mean, of course, there are like exceptions. Like I said, Judas Priest, for me, many years I felt that it's a long gone, or it's much like Metallica, not doing so good albums, decent maybe at best. And then this Firepower comes out, and I'm like, okay, this is really, really good heavy metal album. And there is no consistency to this rule, so to speak. I mean, one could say that like Black Sabbath or Ozzy Osbourne with his solo career, they managed to do some killer tracks later when they were like retirement age. But I still think most of these most memorable songs were done when they were more or less young. And so I cannot help myself thinking if touring is actually killing this creativity, and if doing records too often does the same, because once you are forced to do like you're in a factory of music instead of just doing as a hobby, I think it's gonna affect so many bands, smaller or bigger. And I don't know if there's a real pattern what we should do here. But I know most of my favorite bands, they're not gonna be the same as they used to be. There's no going back. So I guess I have to find new favorites, even though it doesn't matter at this age, but nevertheless. But do you think there's any truth to my opinion, my idea of this, or I'm just talking out of my bottom? I don't know. You decide. Give your opinions. Are there exceptions to this rule? Are there bands which are your favorites and they are still doing their best material after 20 years or 30 years or whatever? And don't mention bands like which are less than, like, say 10 years or younger, because they don't even matter. They are way too young to matter in this case. Random ramblings out, Rauta having beer, and let's stick to some good metal and hope that the dinosaurs will be replaced by even better breed. Cheers and bye bye.